Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are coming to us from in the world. I am Kelly Altland from Bell Laboratories, and I am the co-chair for the Professional Women in Pest Management of New England, along with our chair, Marilyn Masidi from Bono Pest Control, and our committee member, Courtney Karachi from Pest and Exterminators. We are thrilled to once again be able to host a Zoom for all of our friends around the globe. Don't forget to follow us on our social media pages on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We record and post all of our trainings on the YouTube channel within a couple of hours of the webinar. Our third annual Women of Excellence Award will be presented on March the 3rd at the NEPMA Spring Training in Taunton, Massachusetts. Deadline for submissions is February 1st. Applicants must live and work in the New England states. See the application on the NEPMA website on the awards page. We are very excited to expand our swag line. We have t-shirts, tote bags, and tumblers for sale. We will also have pens and decals, which are going to be free. Visit our booth next week at the Eastern Conference at Foxwoods to purchase. We can accept cash as well as credit card. Thank you to the NEPMA Board of Directors and the association membership for supporting our chapter and our goals. In 2022, we are celebrating 5 years since our very first chapter meeting in Taunton, Massachusetts. And now to today's program. The PWIPM of New England is excited to have Heather Alonso from Target Specialty Products as our speaker for today. Heather is a board-certified entomologist and graduated from Clemson University in 2004 with a degree in agronomic systems. She has been in the industry for over 15 years in various roles that focus on technical training. She lives in Columbus, Ohio with her husband, AJ, and her 3 children, Grace, Aiden, and Zoe. We would like to thank Heather for joining us today, and now on to her program.
Thank you, Kelly. I am going to turn off my video because you don't want to see me talking with my hands, but I wanted to say hello to everyone. I see some familiar faces, or at least some familiar pictures. Marcy Downing, I know you. And so I am going to switch over and share my screen. This particular class is going to be a little interesting to do without us being in the same room, okay? Because most of the time I can ask questions, you can raise your hand, you can, comment along the way. So today I will ask that you please use the chat feature, and Courtney is going to be kind enough to read me questions along the way. And I may even be able to dive in and see some of those things as well. So the talk today is on difficult conversations, and I by no means am a psychologist. You heard my background. I've been in the pest management industry for a little over 16 years now, and have worked with many of you guys along the way. And mostly my job has been focused on technical and training. So why in the world would I be the person talking to you today about difficult conversations? Well, really, a lot of it comes from a background in management training. And so what I've found over the years, I can teach you all that you want to know about a bug and how to kill it and all that kind of fun stuff. But what tends to happen in this industry is that the people tend to be the most complicated part of our job, right? Whether it's customers, colleagues, our employees, or even those folks that we report to. Sometimes just communicating with those folks can be a challenge. And so I do want to focus the first part of this conversation today on you yourself and the way that you communicate. And then we'll dive in a little deeper into introducing some of the basic skill sets for handling some of these difficult or crucial type conversations. So I'm going to switch over to my presentation. Courtney, I can see you. Can you give me a nod if you can see my presentation? All right, perfect. Okay. So what makes a conversation difficult? If I was sitting in front of y'all, I would ask you, tell me something that makes a conversation difficult or crucial. And I'm sure you guys would have varying answers that would all kind of come back to similar things at the core. These two books are, fantastic. Difficult Conversations 1, How to Discuss What Matters Most, is a great book. It gives a lot of really good examples of different types of difficult conversations. Most of the material today is going to come from Crucial Conversations, which both of these books you could buy on Amazon, whether you want the digital version or a hard copy for less than $15. They're not super expensive. But I'm going to use a lot of information from Crucial Conversations today to go through just some of the steps for handling some of these things. Now, some of those faces I mentioned earlier probably remember these things from your early days in your career, but many times, whether it was back in high school or college, or even, early stages in management, sometimes our organizations invest in something called communication styles training. This is one of those things that I highly recommend. If you've never done a communication styles quiz, there's lots of different tests and assessments out there, not any better than the other. A lot of my examples today are going to come from DISC, and you can see that in the bottom left corner. DISC is just one of those types of assessments. It's basically measuring how you communicate, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Some of y'all may have done communication styles assessments where you take a little quiz, and at the end it associates your personality or your communication type with a color or an animal or lots of different things. But most of them have 4 or 5 types of communication groups, and we're going to go through what some of those things look like. So in order to be an excellent communicator, and obviously to have these crucial or difficult conversations, we'd like to think that we're excellent communicators to get through those successfully. You do need to understand yourself first. And then, also be self-aware enough of how your information is being received. Okay. So you do need to know how you receive information and what's going on within yourself, but also be able to read the room, if you will. If you're in a group, you're just talking to one person that's your friend, you probably know when you've hit a nerve with them or when you're speaking their language per se. But if you're in a boardroom with, folks with varying different communication styles, you need to be able to at least pick up on how to make sure your message is being communicated effectively with all those different types of folks. So I know some of this stuff may seem somewhat elementary to some of you guys. Some of y'all are probably fantastic at this, but I do just kind of want to hit the basic highlight to this. So that communication styles training I just mentioned, don't forget, you can go out and find tons of different free assessments online. I'm sure some of you guys are probably Googling it right now. There's different types of assessments that you can take. But ultimately what it's doing is looking at what things about your personality and the way that you communicate, how that information comes out to other people. So I mentioned sometimes the people element can be the most complicated thing that we deal with. You could have folks that you think are lazy or bossy. You may have employees that work for you that are 100% money motivated, where others really need a pat on the back or different types of motivation. You can have folks that hate detail, or you can have those folks that just genuinely, like when I write a presentation, I'm going to be honest with you, spelling is not my strong suit. Okay. If it weren't for spell check, I'd be in a whole lot of trouble. So attention to detail is sometimes not my biggest strength. And I work with people on my team who are very quick to point out all of those issues. Many of you might see some spelling errors today, and you're more than welcome to point those out. So the people can be tough. So one of the things that those assessments do, I'm going to let you guys just kind of play around with this here. But if you were to look at this list of words, I'm going to give you a minute or two to just pick the 3 words that most describe you. So you can write them down or just remember them in your head or ignore me entirely, whichever you want to do. But I'll give you just a second to read through these and pick 3 words that most describe you.
Do you want in the workplace or in general?
That's an awesome question. Okay, so since we're doing this from a professional standpoint, think about it at work, but I love that you brought that up, whoever that was. Who brought that up?
I'm Anna Renstrom. I'm from Modern Pest Services in Maine.
Okay, so I'm so glad you brought that up. So I do want you to think about at work here, but I do want to touch on that again when we get to the actual communication style. So I'm going to make a note of that. But think about yourself at work here. Okay, I'm just going to give you another couple seconds here. All right, and then same list, but pick the one word that least describes you. And again, to her point, we're thinking about at work. All right. So because there's 43 of you guys on the call, obviously we can't go through each person's and kind of talk through those things, but I want you I wanted you to write those words down because you're going to see those adjectives used a couple of times when we describe the communication styles. And so you might be able to kind of guess what you would be even without an assessment today, but I still encourage you to go in and do an in detailed assessment, whether it's DISC or Myers-Briggs or whatever assessments out there that you would like to use. Okay, so obviously the biggest thing, none of us are crazy enough to think that we're all built the same. So what is it that makes us different? Obviously we think differently, and some folks will say that it has to do with how you were raised or your your actual genetics. So whether it's just you were born this way or whether it's the household you were brought up in and the things that you were introduced to, quite honestly, it could be all of those things and lots of combinations of things that make you you. If you have siblings, okay, you probably have somewhat similar genetics with your siblings. You were raised in a similar house or a similar, with a similar style, and yet you two could be extremely different, right? So there are obviously some other outside influencers that play into what makes you you. Now, are some things just innate? Are you just born with certain, traits? Absolutely. And I really appreciate that she brought up how, looking at those lists and thinking about how you are at work versus other places. For some people, their communication style could be very different at home with their spouse and their children or with their friends or their church family or school or whatever the case may be. And then at work, they're completely different. I sometimes forget to bring that up because for me, it's kind of the same all the time. Some of us aren't flexible. And that's one of those challenges in my personality. But for some of us, it's the same always. And for others, it really just depends on the setting and how relaxed you are as to whether or not you communicate a little differently. So no matter how we arrive at these things, most of these assessments in general are going to measure a couple of things. Okay. What they're basically doing is taking the whole population and drawing a line through that population and saying, all right, everyone who falls on top of this is an extrovert, right? Their energy is not drained from being in social settings. They tend to be okay, communicating in general. The folks who fall below that line tend to be what we consider to be introverts, or folks who maybe being in social settings for a long period of time may drain their energy. Maybe they're not exactly the same in those situations as they would be in a smaller social setting. Another line that's drawn is this point where folks to the right of this, and let me see if I can find like a marker or something to help with this. So folks to the right of this tend to be, and I say right, hopefully everybody's looking at the same right as me. Folks who fall over here tend to be I don't want to say optimistic, but at least less skeptical. Okay. So maybe these are folks that see the world with rose-colored glasses. Like the world is ultimately a good place and people are ultimately good. Not to say that they don't see the negative or can understand challenge from time to time, but they tend to have a pretty positive, upbeat approach to the world around them. Whereas the folks who fall over here on this side of the line tend to be folks who are somewhat more skeptical. Some folks may say very logic-based thinking. So not so much feeling and emotion goes into the way they make decision and more fact. Okay. So by saying that, what I got at before is the folks who fell above this line tend to be extroverts. Folks below the line tend to be introverts. Folks to the right tend to be those who are a little more optimistic, make decisions with feeling and emotion. And the folks to the left of the line tend to be folks who look at things more black and white. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. I mean, obviously my artwork is fantastic. So whoever has to watch this on YouTube later, please don't judge me for my drawings. Okay. So really what it's looking at any of these assessments, and again, we didn't do an in-depth one just from you writing down a couple of adjectives that describe yourself. But when you do those things, it's going to look at how you respond to challenge, how you influence other people, what kind of work pace you have. I know that sounds like maybe it doesn't matter to some people, but when you're working on teams or you're working with other folks, work pace can be something that can be quite a challenge. Okay. How you prioritize compliance. So before I mentioned spelling, it doesn't matter to me if a word is misspelled on a slide. It's not going to make me lose my mind. But for some people, they would focus on that so heavily that they might miss the actual message. And so you got to remember, some people are really sticklers for that detail and following the rules. And also just your decision-making strategy. So this I mentioned a little bit with the left and right side of the axis when I was saying some folks make decisions based on emotion and feeling, or tend to, and other folks may make decisions based more on fact or logic. So just remember, any of these behavior communication profiles, I think that they're very beneficial for both personal and professional development. I recommend DISC myself just because I've been able to utilize it in the workplace and outside of the workplace, but there's lots of different ones. So anyone that you find that fits your price point or works with your company's or organization's goals would be perfect. Just keep in mind, these things do measure basically what your communication personality is like under normal behaviors. Don't forget, we can get stressed out and things can get a little wild no matter how you tested. But it's important to also remember it does not measure certain things like intelligence or aptitude or experience or morals or value. There's nothing in any of these assessments that say if you fall here in the bottom left quadrant, then you're brilliant. There's nothing like that. It's just how you make decisions and how you react to certain types of information. It's not measuring your intelligence or your aptitude for a specific skill. Okay, so with all that being said, the one that I'm most familiar with is that DISC profile. And so remember, I told you anything that falls kind of above this axis would say extrovert. And most of the folks who would fall below here would be more of your introverts. Folks over here tend to be, the positive folks who make decisions based on, not just facts, but also some emotion and human element. And folks over here tend to be those folks who look at fact-based logic, black and white type approach to the world. Now, why in the world does all of this stuff matter? It matters because of how you communicate. You tend to communicate based on the things that you would want to hear. Okay. And so if you remember back to those adjectives that I pulled up in the first slide or so, folks that fall in that top left corner or extroverted, logic decision folks tend to be seen as dominant. Okay. Those folks tend to describe themselves as active or assertive, bold, skeptical, and challenging, amongst many other things, I'm sure. They tend to be motivated by bottom line results and challenge and action. A lot of times these folks can be fantastic on a team, or if you fall into that category, typically you're someone who gets results, you like to make decisions, and you're a natural leader in those situations. But the biggest weakness is that they can be very much perceived as insensitive or impatient. And sometimes because of their competitive nature, they can create unnecessary win-loss situations. Okay. I have a child. I mean, I'm sure many of you guys have kids with different types of personalities, or coworkers, or siblings, or someone in your life who have these different things. But my children are all very, very different, just like I'm sure many of yours are. And I have one that is the most competitive kid on the planet. He will compete with his sister to who can get up the stairs the fastest, who can, fold the most laundry, how many seconds it took him to get to the mailbox. These are all things that do not matter in the grand scheme of things. But to him, he's going to create a win-loss no matter what it is. Who finishes their dinner the quickest, who, does whatever. And so in some cases, when you're dealing with a lot of folks who aren't ultra competitive, this is just draining to their day-to-day. So just remember, there are certainly advantages to any of these styles, but there's also some weaknesses as well. Their biggest fear typically is being taken advantage of or appearing weak. And why in the world would this be important? If you are communicating with someone who you would describe as a dominant type person, you have to be very mindful in a conversation that could become difficult or crucial, that you don't make them feel unsafe by doing these things, taking advantage of, making them feel like you're taking advantage of them, or making them feel like you're saying that they're weak, or, whatever would sort of demotivate them there. These are just some examples of dominant people. I'm sure there's good ones, bad ones, and all in between. Now, if you remember the top right of that quadrant, I said those were people who were extroverted, that tended to make decisions more on people and emotion than just your logic, black and white type stuff. And these people would also be described as active, but also good storytellers, motivators. They tend to be, motivated by enthusiasm, action, collaboration. You absolutely want these folks on your team. And if you're one of them, congratulations, because you tend to be the enthusiastic decision-making type folks and promote collaboration and teamwork. Now, just like anything else, when you have these strengths, you can certainly have weaknesses. And sometimes these folks can be seen as impulsive, or disorganized, or overly expressive. Now, these type of people, influencers, their biggest fear tends to be rejection or not being heard. It's not necessarily that you have to do things their way, but they do genuinely feel like they need a seat at the table. They need to be able to voice where they're coming from or who they're standing for in those situations. I know I'm blowing through this super fast, and I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get through some of these in case some of you folks haven't ever done communication styles training. All right, so on that bottom right of the quadrant, so these would be folks who would fall more on the introverted side of things, but still very much that positive, people decision-making type deal. These are going to be folks who tend to prioritize steadiness. They're seen as humble, supportive. They tend to be motivated by support and collaboration and stability. And you absolutely want these folks on your team because they are good listeners. They tend to be accommodating, and they like for everything to be fair. Okay. They sometimes can be seen as people pleasers, though, or folks who can be easily taken advantage of. And these are also folks who can shut down when that conflict arises. So the whole point of today's conversation is difficult talks or crucial conversations. And if you're dealing with someone who receives information the way that someone in a steadiness priority does, then you have got to be extraordinarily aware of when they shut down. You have to be able to look for some of those cues to make sure that you are, again, making them feel safe in that conversation. Their biggest fears tend to be letting people down, but also rapid change tends to be very difficult for these folks. So with many of your organizations over the last couple of years, I'm sure you've seen adaptations to lots of change, right? Like we've gone to a pretty virtual world when it comes to a lot of our meetings and conferences. Many of us have had to, balance more of the work from home and even like the home life, things that used to go on after hours. When our kids were all out of school or different folks were working from home, there were a lot of times where we were balancing all those things all day long. And so sometimes those rapid changes can be very difficult for folks who tend to prioritize this steadiness type communication style. All right. And then last, but certainly not least, are going to be your conscientious folks. And I'm reading it to make sure I spelled it right because it's not my skill. These folks tend to be detail-oriented, objective, systematic, and skeptical. So remember on that quadrant, these are going to be folks who probably fall more on that introverted line, but on the same side of the axis for, black and white logic, fact-based decision-making. So these are folks who a lot of folks would describe as skeptical, systematic. Also, they're going to be motivated by accuracy, stability, and challenge. Their strengths tend to be objectivity, analyzing, and they tend to love a challenge. And their biggest weaknesses are going to be that they can be rigid or sometimes seen as impatient or inconsiderate. And typically their fears are being wrong or strong displays of emotion. So if someone starts crying in your meeting, some of these folks may just not know how to handle that. Okay. And they may come off as very insensitive or inconsiderate. When I say being wrong, some folks who are really strong in this conscientious priority, they not only don't want to be wrong, but they don't want to be wrong ever. Okay. So not a situation where like just in front of people, it may come off that they weren't right, but they can be, answering trivia on the radio in their car all alone, and it would demotivate them if they were wrong. Okay. Like they just don't want to be wrong. So, all these things are important to understand. If you're going to be a successful communicator, whether that's through a leadership position, through a customer service position, just in your basic interpersonal relationships, it's important to recognize that you are going to fall somewhere in there, right? As a communicator, you could be a combination of these things, or you could be really strong in one of those quadrants. You could certainly exhibit some of all of those types of styles, but other people do too. And so it's really important to recognize that. I'm going to give just a second for some questions here in a minute, but in order to implement those styles, and again, we gave 25 minutes of a very broad overview of these things. I would say if you're interested in this or you want to learn more about it, feel free to email me. I'll give you some thoughts on where you can go to get some really good assessments. Or there's even some things you can do online that are free. Once you understand your style, your communication style itself, and you understand how to recognize it in other people, there's some other challenges as far as who you're talking to, not just how they communicate, but even this multi-generational workforce that we function in, that can be confusing. A lot of times, if you can bring yourself to, a what's in it for me type message, it can be very helpful. And I don't mean that in a selfish way. Just because people want to understand what's in it for them doesn't necessarily mean that they're extremely selfish. They just want to understand, like, what does this mean to me? If it's a new company initiative, if it's a change to a benefits plan, if it's a change to a routing schedule or a pricing structure or whatever the case is, you do need to make sure that you somehow are incorporating within that message what is in it for them or what it means to them. Now, back to those communication styles, I will tell you, if you're dealing with somebody who falls in that dominance category that we talked about earlier, that, assertive, direct type person, they typically want to know what you want from them. Okay. So if you can address, look at your message that you're communicating and what is the bottom line, what you want from them, that's going to appease your D type personalities or communication styles. People who fall over here in that influencer side, they kind of want to know who. So who's on the team, who's going to be working together, who benefits from this, who's working overtime, who's changing their route, who's paying more. They tend to be very people oriented in those messages. Typically, your steadiness folks want to know how do you plan to implement change, or how do you plan to make whatever you're communicating come to fruition. And your conscientious folks typically want to know why. Why are we changing something, or why are we doing this in general? Okay. So I'm going to give you guys just a minute if you do have any comments. I know there's really not, in 25 minutes of me giving you some quick communication style stuff, I don't know that there's a ton of questions. If there are, feel free to type them into your chat or even unmute yourself. If you have suggestions on assessments that you've done in the past that have been really helpful, or that you or your team have used, then please do share those here. I think everybody's interested in, learning more about personal and professional development. So feel free to drop those into the chat box. Hi, Maria.
Hi.
So poor Maria's probably heard this 8,000 times at this point, but you get to hear it again. So the one who came back and said, I just want to say I'm 100% in the blue box and this hits close to me. I got to tell you, I personally fall more in that green world. Okay. So the very direct type person, and, it doesn't change for me at home or at work. And it can be very difficult, because sometimes I am very much seen as inconsiderate or not sensitive to folks who need a little bit more of the how are we changing things, or why are we changing things. And so, from a leadership perspective, that is definitely an area that I continue to struggle with, and I have to continue to prepare when I have conversations. And we're going into that for sure on the conversations point. But for me, I'm aware that that's something that's hard for me to do. And so I do have to spend a lot more time preparing to make sure that I don't, seem disingenuous, or that I don't seem insensitive. So self-awareness is one of those things, guys, that, over the years, I've learned in teaching like technical talks, like when I do, insect ID or those kinds of things, it's pretty easy to see that common sense is sort of dead. Okay. I don't mean to be negative, like my negative self can be occasionally, but common sense isn't what it used to be. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Common sense basically means that people draw from common experiences and arrive at a very similar, resolve to a problem. And now, because we do have multi-generational workforces, now because we do have so many different learning styles, communication styles, all in one workplace, we see that these experiences aren't as common as they used to be. Okay. So we do have to sometimes take additional steps in preparing for certain conversations, because we might need to cover some basics that we may perceive as common sense. Same thing goes for self-awareness. There is a day right now today where we're all functioning in a world where maybe not everyone is as self-aware, or they don't necessarily realize how they come off to other folks. So I think this is another one of those things that really we need to work on within our own personal character, right? Is to be able to see that occasionally you might come off as, not having an opinion if you don't speak up during a meeting, or you might come off as insensitive if you brush past the people element of things. So being self-aware is something that we can all certainly work on. And we can talk to those folks who are close to us, our family and our friends, to kind of say, hey, what can I work on? I mean, I'm having these conversations, but I feel like I'm not getting anywhere, or I'm not getting the results I want. What do you think? And maybe some of your close friends and colleagues can give you some advice on how to be aware of those things. A good book on this, Who Moved My Cheese? Oh my gosh. Great book. Check it out. I'm sure many of you guys have read that one, but there's some change and we need to be aware of it. And there's sometimes some self-reflecting that goes into that. Accountability is another biggie for me. And this is one of those things that is, this is something that I have to continue to develop and work on, is my own accountability in a situation. Crucial Conversations is the book that I mentioned at the very beginning. And this is kind of where we're going to do a little more of a deep dive now. Now that I know that in 30 minutes, you didn't learn everything you've ever wanted to know about your communication style. But I do think that you at least maybe it sparked some interest in learning more. Or maybe you did resonate with one of those 4 quadrants a little bit. And so now that we know a little bit more about ourselves, let's talk a little bit about these crucial conversations. So what makes a conversation crucial? Obviously, we might all have our own opinion on that, but by definition in this particular book or in this message, opposing opinion, strong emotion, and high stakes are coming into play. So some examples of that could be, on a personal level, ending a relationship or asking someone for money or to repay a loan. But in a work environment, certainly talking about, behaviors that are not, kosher. They're basically, offensive to some people, critiquing somebody's work, or, honestly giving an unfavorable performance review or receiving an unfavorable performance review could certainly be that as well. Okay. I'm not going to go into the in-laws thing. My husband works in the industry, so I need to not bring the in-law part in. All right. All right. So the biggest thing here, and again, we only have, like 20 minutes or so to kind of cover this. So I do want to just say, if I were going to break down crucial conversations or the difficult conversations into 3 bite-sized pieces, I would say that the preparation part is one that we often ignore. And so I do want to hit on that. The execution of the actual conversation, and we'll talk a little bit about how to recognize certain things there. And then probably the most missed element of all of it is the follow-up and making sure that you're circling back around and have an actual action plan for the follow-up. So if you do read the book, Crucial Conversations, you're going to see this diagram that's brought up multiple times. And this is basically saying, hey, there's you and there's the other people. And at the end of this conversation, ultimately, you want everybody to share their piece. And you want more information going into what they call the pool of shared meaning. It's the pool of, it's a place to share all of your information. So the more information that goes there, probably the better decision that can be made or the better outcome from that conversation. And if you see at the top of it, it wants you to avoid silence and violence. Okay. Now, I don't think you guys are going into a boardroom and just, brawling with each other or anything. I mean, you could be, I don't know. I'd love to come and watch if that's happening. But I do think there are certain types of violent behavior in a conversation that we tend to overlook, things like labeling or attacking or controlling. And then also that silence part of it, where somebody just shuts down. The minute there's conflict, they just withdraw, they avoid, or they in some way mask their the conflict on their end of things by just, not addressing it directly. So again, I'll come back to this a little bit along the way, but I do want to talk about just what is that pool of shared meaning and why do we even care? Ultimately, in this book, what they're saying is that if you're having a difficult conversation or a crucial conversation where you have those opposing opinions or high stakes or a lot of emotion, right? The biggest thing is, how do we get to a safe space of dialogue where everybody can communicate their side? Okay. So if I enter into this conversation with, preconceived notions of, I'm going in here and this is what I'm saying, and then I'm done, right? I'm going to tell Kelly like it is. And then, I'm walking out of there because I'm going to tell her, how this goes. Then ultimately we've never gotten there. Like, she is going to hear what I have to say. She may agree or disagree. She may see things, on a different platform entirely, and I've basically accomplished nothing. So I do need to prepare myself for how to stay calm. A lot of times people say, don't let your emotions get to you. I don't think emotions are bad. I think, we're all emotional people. That's what makes us people, right? But I do think there needs to be a way for the emotion to be able to be a part of you, but not control you. Okay. So if you're upset, there's nothing wrong with saying, I'm upset about this. If you're angry, you can be angry. If you're sad, you can be sad. Nobody should have to suppress all of that emotion. However, it shouldn't control the entire tone of that communication. And I think that's definitely something that I struggle with, especially on the anger front. Once I get angry, it's very difficult for me to not let that control the tone of the conversation. Anytime those things do take over, then you're limiting the amount of information that's being brought out. And we all just said that we all communicate differently, or that we receive information differently, right? But Kelly, if I use the example of me coming at Kelly and attacking her because she didn't do something my way, she may have a very different perspective of how this job was to get done. Or I may not have communicated with her effectively on what exactly I wanted from her to start with. And so I really do need to make sure that I'm giving her an opportunity to tell her story as well. So here's some references in that book, Crucial Conversation, that talks about that pool of shared meaning and why it's good for all individuals to be able to get accurate and relevant information out. Because as a group, whether it's just two of us talking or it's an entire, board of directors talking, the more information we have out there, the more informed our decision is going to be. This is something that really resonates with me. I just mentioned I can get angry pretty quickly. So speak when you're angry and you'll make the best speech you will ever regret. I remember my mom telling me, the whole, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. I did not listen to that piece of advice. We'll just put it that way. I do very much struggle on when I'm angry, getting myself in check to be able to have a good conversation. And so I do think that for most of us, we've sort of been taught, like, don't say anything if you're mad. And I don't necessarily think that's the best way to approach it. I just think maybe taking some time to self-reflect, be self-aware of how you may come off to others, maybe take some notes or write down some points that you want to get across. Those things will definitely put you in a better space for communicating effectively versus just communicating emotionally. All right. So back to this crucial conversation piece, in that, I told you I'm going to break it down kind of into three parts. So preparation, the execution of the conversation, and then the follow-up. In the preparation for these conversations, I think it is a good time to reflect on how you communicate and how the folks that you're going to be communicating with receive information. Sometimes you may know them well, other times you may not. So it could be that you're, giving a message to a large group and you don't know all those folks. So in those cases, you need to assume that you've got somebody from all those different styles in the room, and that you need to make sure that your message effectively hits all of them. If this is a difficult conversation in a one-on-one, something like a performance review, or a difficult conversation with a colleague about, a certain behavior that you find offensive. I'll give you another great example. So I once upon a time was in a situation where I had to do ride-alongs with technicians on it's like a quality control type thing. And I was spending a week with a technician out in Arizona, and in all reality, this particular individual, he smelled bad. I mean, I don't know another way to say it. Like, I'm sure some of you guys are like, oh my gosh, but like, I'm not meaning like he smelled sort of bad. I mean, like, this was wildly offensive. And so I remember thinking to myself how grateful I was that I wasn't his manager, that I didn't have to have that kind of conversation. Because I'm sure that customers noticed, that could certainly happen within an office or something like that. Anytime you're dealing with something that can make someone feel uncomfortable, like their personal hygiene or, their vocabulary or something that they're accustomed to, there can definitely be some fear in how you're going to get that across. So again, I didn't have to have the conversation with him. I'm sure that his supervisor did it with tact. But we do have to remember, sometimes instead of just coming at it with a fact, you do kind of have to start with your heart. Like, what ultimately are you trying to get at here? So, in that case, it's more about presenting a professional appearance, and those types of things. And I can only imagine what some of you guys have had to deal with when talking with employees on appropriate dress or any of those types of things. I will say too, in the book, one of the things that really hit home for me was this fool's choice. Okay. So a lot of times what we do is, if we've got a difficult conversation coming up, we say, well, either I can say this and hurt their feelings, or I don't say anything at all and nothing gets done. And we sort of just decide that those are our only two options. Well, we've applied those two options ourselves. Those aren't necessarily things that are actually what we're facing. Instead, we're just saying, hey, I don't want to, if I speak up, I'm going to hurt their feelings. If I say nothing, this isn't going to change. There's probably some middle ground there. Maybe you don't speak up and say, hey, you stink, guy, you need to put on some deodorant. Instead, there's probably a way to communicate, a company policy on presenting themselves professionally and not necessarily having to just be rude about it. Okay. You can still be direct without being rude. So what you would ask yourself in these situations would be, what do I want to happen and what do I not want to happen? I don't want to hurt this person's feelings. I don't want them to quit. I don't want them to think that I'm attacking them. But instead, I really do want my company to be presented professionally, and I want this individual to be successful with the tools I've given him for his job. And so there's got to be a better way to communicate that. And you don't have to put yourself in this fool's choice situation where you're saying it's either all or nothing. Either I'm going to go at it here and it's going to end poorly, or I'm going to do nothing and it's going to end poorly. Many times when I talked about the communication styles earlier, I mentioned paying attention to, how the other person receives information and making sure they stay safe. Safety is key in a conversation just as much as it is in many other things that we do in life. So if we notice that someone shuts down at the moment that there's conflict, we need to try and figure out how to keep that person engaged in conversation without making them feel like, this conflict is overwhelming. So maybe we include them in the conversation more at that point if there's multiple people there. Maybe we let them express themselves first if we know that they tend to kind of withdraw once direct and opinionated people start to contribute. And we always remember to go back to them to ask for follow-up or see how they're feeling along the way. Sometimes you can start a conversation and have no idea this thing is going to be crucial or difficult. You could think it's just a routine conversation where you're mentioning a project or you're talking through just a basic initiative, and all of a sudden it turns crucial or difficult without any planning. Okay. So you didn't have time to kind of write down your thoughts or, put together an agenda or do any of those things. when folks start getting emotional, or they start telling stories that have a lot more non-fact involved. Okay. So if we're in a conversation and everything we're talking about is, based on fact or results, or, this is what happened yesterday, whatever, when we start getting into a lot more feelings at this point, then we do probably need to take a step back and realize we're in the midst of a difficult or a crucial conversation. If you need to stop that conversation and come back to it, you certainly can. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, we need to table this for right now. Let's meet on this tomorrow. Because the more prepared you are for those things, the better off you're going to be. All right. So here we go. I'm sorry. I see that I only have like 10 minutes left and I have a whole lot of stuff to cover. So I'm trying to go fast, but not skip any of the important stuff. Silence and violence I mentioned briefly earlier, and this is one of those things you can look for in those conversations to see, like, hey, do I have any type of non-safe environment that's happening, or is somebody's safety being breached in this conversation? And so one of the things that comes up is silence. The other is violence. Sarcasm. I am one of the most sarcastic people there is, and I never really realized how that comes across, right? Like if I'm in a meeting where something's uncomfortable, a lot of times I'll tell a joke or say something sarcastic, or, kind of just push some element of it under the rug. And that's just as dangerous as attacking and labeling, right? So being passive aggressive can be just as dangerous as being aggressive in these situations. So you want to look for these types of things. Are the people that you're talking to, or the person that you're talking to, starting to mask their opinion or their side of the story? Are they avoiding something altogether? Or withdrawing, like I mentioned, like maybe they're talking a lot initially, then we hit some point and then they stop talking. Maybe at that point we realize, like, hey, let's back up. How do you feel about this? Hey, you were talking earlier and then we got to this point, and then, are you feeling differently about it than I am? Are you seeing that differently than me? Tell me what you think. Those are all ways to kind of re-engage them back into the conversation. So, that's just checking to see if those folks are going in that direction. I mentioned that we all have a communication style that's under normal behavior, but sometimes when we get stressed out, we may react differently than we normally would. Let's say we have, a high pressure emergency situation. From a regulatory perspective, maybe we've had, a chemical spill and, it's getting into a water source, or maybe we've got, an employee that's injured, or something that's really a stressful environment, and we may behave very differently there. So again, when you get to that point, a lot of times just taking a step back, breathe. For me, if there's something that hits that says, I need to respond to this urgently, more than likely, those are the things that I need to take a step back and reflect on before I make a decision. I'm not saying wait 3 weeks on it. I'm just saying, if I feel the need to push a button right now, a lot of times those super urgent feelings, I may actually need to sit back and reflect, or call a colleague, or ask for advice, or even just do a little bit of research before I make those decisions. All right, so I mentioned making it safe for other folks. One thing to do is to look for some mutual purpose. So if you are having a conversation about something that can be difficult, whether it's, a performance review or whatever the case may be, it could be that you're the one who is being reprimanded for something at work or in personal life. And so in those situations, it's always really good to hear what the other person has to say, and then try and come to a place of mutual purpose. So at the end of the day, if it's a work situation, it's critical to say, all right, at the end of the day, I want you to be successful. I want this organization to be successful. Here's what we're going to do to get there. And I do see a lot of your comments coming through. I'm sorry. I promise you that I will get to all of them and go through them in just a minute, but I only have a couple more slides to get through that I think are really critical, and then we'll definitely get there. So with these, one of the other things that I think is important is when you do see that safety has been breached, when you do see that you've hurt someone, and maybe it's not your fault. I shouldn't say hurt them as far as their feelings are concerned. When you've hurt their ability to be able to communicate and add information to that shared pool, it's important to remember that you can apologize at any point. Okay. So you can say things like, I'm really sorry if I made you feel like I was attacking you, or saying that your work wasn't quality. I do, I trust you. However, yesterday didn't meet a deadline, and I've got a concern about that. Can you help me understand what happened there? Without saying, without just leaving it at a point where they feel like, everything they've ever done is wrong, kind of deal. So you can apologize along the way without conceding your position at all. All right. I'm not going to be able to read all of these quotes. I'm so sorry. You've got to read the book. The book is fantastic. Okay. So what do you do in a situation where maybe you don't have the same purpose? So I mentioned performance reviews or spills or employee accidents. In all those situations, I would hope that everybody's focus would be the same, which is, nobody gets hurt. Everybody does a good job. The organization is successful, those types of things. But in some situations, you may have just wildly opposing purposes in a conversation. And so if you don't have a mutual purpose, the first thing you got to do is commit to seek it. It may just be that you want to be able to find a new way to communicate with this individual, or that you want to be able to share your side. Maybe that's your goal. I mean, you might have to commit to seek something that wasn't your original purpose. Recognize the purpose behind the strategy, invent that mutual purpose, and then brainstorm new strategies to get somewhere. This one's a little more difficult to give a good example of that would reach everyone in different types of positions. But I do know there's been many times where in work-related conversations, maybe I've wanted to go in one direction entirely and the rest of my team has wanted to go in another direction. Maybe that has to do with a software selection. Maybe that has to do with a process or a procedure. I've seen it happen, many times when companies are trying to make a decision on, a direction for a large company initiative. And I bring up software because I know many of you guys are aware of, how you use your pest control softwares and routing softwares and things to that effect. And sometimes we can really have different varying opinions on what we want based on the end goal. And so a lot of times we don't even communicate that, so make sure that you are being as candid as possible, communicating your end result goals, and maybe you can seek to find some mutual purpose along the way. Maybe it's not going to be that you resolve everything that minute, but it could definitely be that you do agree that, hey, routing is a priority. It could be something that simple that can help you work towards a good communication path. Now, there's so much more to this, and we only have 2 minutes. So I'm going to go to the last slide here and just show you, remind you of the names of these books so that you guys can check them out. I promise I would be more than happy to send over anything extra that you need. I think I've shared my PDF of this presentation with Kelly. So if anybody wants to see the whole thing, I only really missed a couple of slides. So the biggest thing is, you don't want to see a white slide. There we go. Maybe here. Yeah. Okay. So the communication styles I mentioned was DISC. I saw that Amy Chapman put some information in as well on EQ, and EQ Applied. And so she has the author listed there, and it is, she says it's an excellent resource for awareness, So that's fantastic. Talking isn't training, as I'm talking and pretending to train here. Crucial conversations, difficult conversations. And then I mentioned communication styles. DISC for the workplace is the one that I brought up most often, but there are tons of different communication style assessments out there. So I just encourage you guys to keep reading, keep digging in and doing more personal and professional development. It's only going to make you better and more successful at what you do, personal life and in your professional life. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Kelly, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Heather. That was just a fun-filled, action-packed, lots of information hour with you. Really appreciate your time. So like Heather said, I do have a copy of her presentation, and we will be posting this training on YouTube by the end of the day today. So thanks again for everyone for participating, and look forward to seeing you at the next event. Have a wonderful day, everyone.